I think many of you guys know this has been a very well-received signature program co-hosted by the Department of Asian and Policy Studies at EdUHK and the Division of Public Policy at HKUST. And we have been running this for 2 years, which is highly successful. And today, the topic we feature is crisis management. For obvious reasons, we are not, going to do it on the face-to-face mode for the sake of everyone's safety. And we have decided to make it online so that everyone of you can access very conveniently. So today, the topic is a very timely one, crisis management. I think many of you guys know that 2019 was a very special and difficult year for Hong Kong. And we have seen very extraordinary, massive social unrest triggered by the anti-extradition law. And then Hong Kong became the headlines of almost everyone, every mainstream international mass media. And this year, we have been confronting another major crisis, the COVID-19. So within just less than 12 months, this city is devastated by two major public crises, and one political and another public health. So today we have two speakers, and as usual, we have Professor Anthony Cheung, a person who doesn't need any further introduction. So he is a very prominent public figure in Hong Kong and in Asia. And Professor Cheung was the president of Hong Kong Institute of Education before he was invited to join the government as the Secretary for Housing and Transport from 2012 to 2017. And he's a veteran public sector leader. And then we also have Dr. James Wong from the Division of Public Policy at HKUST, sharing with us all his ideas and insights about crisis management. So without further ado, so probably let me basically outline how we are going to proceed. So first of all, we'll have 20 minutes dedicated to introductory points. So both speakers will talk a little bit and setting the scene. And later on, we'll basically move to the first main part of the seminar today. We're mainly going to talk about the social unrest last year, the anti-extradition controversies and governance crisis confronted by the Hong Kong government. And then we'll leave 15 minutes for Q&A. And before we move to the second half of the seminar today on the COVID-19 crisis, which also run on the same format, 30 minutes plus 15 minutes. And then in the end, we can wrap up. All right. So first of all, now may I invite Professor Anthony Cheung to start his remarks, please.
Thank you, Alex. I guess people are familiar with the kind of challenge we are facing due to two crises, which we are talking about today. Last year's anti-extradition controversy and the subsequent political confrontations, which are still going on, and also the latest coronavirus crisis. As introduction, okay. Now, Hong Kong, a city of crisis. I'm not referring to the current situation, but Hong Kong has always been a city facing various natural hazards and other urban challenges. In the past, people in Hong Kong, they were so used to typhoons, landslides, flooding. Flooding has improved a lot since the 1990s, and also urban hazards, mostly to do with fire. The Ka-lei building fire in 1996, the Lang Kwai Fong stampede in 1993, which is not a fire-related crisis, but these are the kind of urban hazards that Hong Kong faced in the past. Before the handover, when Hong Kong was still under British rule, we have the 1966 disturbance, 1967 riots, 1970s when Hong Kong faced rampant corruption. We established the ICAC, and then in 1977, there was a serious confrontation between the police and the ICAC, which some people at that time described as the police mutiny. And then that led to amnesty, partial amnesty for some corrupt police people. And then during the Sino-British talks on the future of Hong Kong, we had the Black Saturday in 1983. That refers to the situation at the weekend, the 24th of September, 1983. And there was panic buying at that time, including toilet papers, because of the sudden drop of the Hong Kong dollar against the US dollar. And then the next month, in October, the government announced a new scheme linking the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar. And this peg is still in place today. And then 1983 to 86, we have the banking crisis. During that crisis, 7 banks, local banks, were in great trouble. And 3 of them were taken over by the government for a period. The other 4 were taken over by private entities with government assistance. So we can see that Hong Kong has always faced all kinds of urban crises and economic challenges. For natural disasters and urban hazards, in fact, Hong Kong has developed a very elaborate set of emergency measures, emergency management manual, and related mechanisms for handling crisis. However, the kind of crisis that Hong Kong has faced since 1997 has become slightly different. We still have the usual natural challenges as before, but we have new challenges. Okay. Now let me just highlight a few major post-1997 crises and disasters. Health-related hazards came along very early after 1997. The avian flu, which we commonly call the bird flu disease. And then, of course, the SARS crisis in 2003. And later on, the swine flu, 2009. And during my term as secretary, we faced the excess lead in water in public housing estates. That was also related to public health. And then the current COVID-19 epidemic. Economic crises were more serious. The Asian financial crisis right after the handover, and then the global financial crisis about 10 years ago. Political crisis, before 1997, we had the 1967 rise. After 1997, there have been several major crises to deal with politics. The July 1st protests in 2003, protests against national education, 2012, the Occupy Central protests, 2014, and then last year's anti-extradition protests, leading to political confrontations, which are still going on. And then I mentioned transport-related incidents because I was Secretary for Transport, but Hong Kong faced the first challenge in terms of transport-related incidents, also right after reunification, the opening of the new international airport in 1998. There was a bit of confusion in the first few weeks, and that made Hong Kong very prominent in international news. But then all international airports in the world opened with crisis, in Malaysia, in other cities as well. And then the 2012 vessel collision near Lemon Island. Now I've highlighted all these incidents, crises, just to let us know that facing a crisis is nothing new for Hong Kong, and indeed for any other cities. And then we can see that after 1997, in fact, as far as Hong Kong is concerned, we have faced more crises than the previous government in terms of major crises. So crisis management has become a very important function of the government. And indeed, if we look at the literature, crisis management is one of the core functions of all governments. Now, I'm not going to go into academic literature, but many of us know that even as early as the 1980s, some scholars came up with the idea that modern society is a risk society. The kind of risk that modern society faces comes not just from nature. It's not just about natural disasters, but also human-made disasters or natural disasters made worse because of human intervention. Of course, sometimes human intervention could minimize natural disasters as well. And then we have manufactured crises in relation to the risk from nuclear energy, in relation to construction projects, for example, high-tech risks because of high technology, and then you have cyber risks as well. Sometimes you say high-tech means high risk. The new fintech trend also gives rise to new risks to individuals. And then many of the risks that we are facing today are becoming globalized. Climate change is a global challenge. If there is any financial crisis, it's going to be global. The current COVID-19 epidemic, again, apart from being a pandemic, which affects many countries, it's also becoming a global crisis because it leads to economic challenges. Now, everybody is saying that we are going into a deep recession because of the epidemic. Now, we'll go into that later on. After every crisis, lessons are bound to be learned. And usually, these lessons will be normalized into a new SOP, standard operating procedure. However, even though lessons are learned, oftentimes the new SOP may not be strictly followed because somehow, let's say a few years after a major crisis, people might have forgotten about the risk that they faced a few years ago. So we need new crises sometimes to remind people of the risk that surrounds us. And even if you have a new SOP, sticking too rigidly to the books may sometimes backfire because every risk, every crisis is different, is unique. Because yes, they may look similar. It's like the COVID-19 virus that we are facing today. It's similar to SARS, but it's not SARS. The symptoms are not the same. The impact may not be the same. We have not come to any conclusive findings about this latest new coronavirus. And every crisis is induced by specific external and internal circumstances. And therefore, you cannot just treat a crisis as a repeat of the past. And therefore, following the current SOP, resulting from lesson learning from the past, may not always work. So we have to be very alert to the features of every crisis coming before us. And in any major crisis, there are bound to be a lot of views, expert views, and there are many experts. And we like to laugh about experts. We say, well, most experts, indeed all experts, have two hands. On the one hand, this is a situation. On the other hand, that will be the situation. So how do we balance different views? And then lay people, ordinary people, have their views as well. And this is what makes crisis management sometimes very challenging and difficult because you have to balance different views. You have to take into different concerns. And therefore, again, in the literature, there is a lot of discussion about the politics of crisis management. Crisis management is not just about the professional, specialist branch of knowledge that relates directly to the type of challenge we are facing. For example, the current COVID-19 virus. Of course, it is a public health issue, but when it comes to a crisis management situation, is not just about medical solution to the problem, because the problem is not just medical. And I would like to make a few points in relation to the politics of crisis management. The very important point is crisis prevention is not the same as crisis management. In other words, a society or a government may have failed in terms of crisis prevention because of the lack of sensitivity, lack of early warning, so on and so forth. However, once a crisis has occurred, how do you deal with the consequences of that crisis? Now, that is crisis management. So when we appraise an authority's or society's response, how effective it is to handle the crisis that has happened, whether you like it or not, now that is a challenge. Now, you may blame that government or that society for being insufficiently sensitive to the risk. However, the crisis has occurred. So it's not about crisis prevention per se, it's about managing the crisis. But after the crisis has been managed, after the challenge is over, then we have to ask, are there any lessons to be learned that can help to prevent the crisis from recurring? Now, during a crisis, of course, depending on the nature of the crisis, there will be specific solutions. If it is a health-related crisis, of course, a medical solution. If it is a financial, economic crisis, maybe a budgetary solution, an economic strategy solution. However, handling the crisis, there are some common points that need to be given great attention. First, communication. Because in any crisis, there is bound to be panic, because a crisis may be something uncertain. And human beings worry about anything that is not certain. They fear uncertainty. And therefore, in terms of communication, it is very important that we communicate accurately. What do you mean by accurately? Sometimes we are talking about the unknown. So therefore, a crisis narrative that is able to provide practical messaging is important, because you are addressing the people, the society, which is becoming very nervous, very anxious. So your practical messaging should be about what to do in this crisis. What is a crisis? What is the nature of the hazard? What are the likely consequences? Likely, may not be definitely the case, but likely. And there's always a challenge or dilemma over how much to tell. I mean, you worry about overloading people with all kinds of information. You also would like to be selective, but sometimes you may have prejudice. So this is a very challenging thing. And most of the time, as can be shown in the current COVID-19 crisis across the world, most governments are being blamed for lack of communication, for insufficient information provided to the population. Now, so that's the first C, communication and crisis narrative. The second C, coordination. And that is very important too, because you involve mobilizing the whole society, different branches of government, different departments. So how do you provide effective coordination so that there is a unified voice, there is a unified sort of pace of response, and you need to have clear command too, so people know which agency is sort of leading the fight. And then government leadership is important. So that's the second C. The third C, confidence and credibility. If you look at the current situation, we'll come back to this with more discussion later on about this virus. Most people would doubt the effectiveness of various responses, various solutions. So how do you restore confidence? How do you make sure that people believe that actions being done are really to the point And then you have rumors as well, and rumors travel very quickly. So that's a third C. The fourth C, conflicting views about experts. Experts may have similar views, but they may also disagree. And then the fourth C, very important, crisis mutates. I'll give the example here in the slide. Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Now this, according to the story, in the 19th century, Mrs. O'Leary's cow ran amok in the stable. And that led to the house fire. And eventually, that house fire led to the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So a very small incident, a cow running amok in the stable led to the whole city in flame. In other words, a crisis can mutate, panic can breed its own crisis, and a small incident, if not handled properly, or if not handled at an early stage, may involve in the huge crisis. And in the case of a virus, it may become a confidence crisis, eventually economic crisis, and a governance crisis. In any crisis, blame and shame, and this is the nature of politics. This is the nature of human society. So I don't think governments can easily get away from blaming and shaming. And in fact, most governments get blamed for doing things or for not doing things. And in terms of lesson learning, as you said, this should be a standard step in any post-crisis situation. But the question is, even if some lessons are learned, and if these lessons led to reforms, can reform sustain? No. If reform cannot be sustained, that will not help in terms of crisis prevention. My final point in this introductory part, again, in the literature, there's a lot of discussion relating crisis management to governance capacity and government legitimacy. Of course, we are not suggesting that only government can handle a crisis, but all governments have to handle a crisis, and all governments have to fight a crisis hand in hand with the community, with society. Society cannot fight a crisis alone because society tends to be fragmented, different interests. So you need a government to unify people, to mobilize social resources. So therefore, in any crisis situation, as far as the government is concerned, it has to display organizational capacity. It has to have the ability to mobilize and coordinate various public resources. And it has to guide the community in terms of perceptions, in terms of attitudes. For example, the current situation in COVID-19, the importance of social distancing. Again, we need government to step in. I'm not suggesting that government interventions is the only variable, but government intervention is almost indispensable. So therefore, whether or not government efforts are successful depends very much on whether that government enjoys sufficient support, trust, and ultimately legitimacy from the community. So I make these points at this, in this part, and then we come back to some major points later on. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Cheung. And now, could I invite Dr. James Wong to offer his opening remarks? James, please.
Okay. So thank you so much to Professor Cheung for his fruitful, comprehensive introduction. It's my honor, indeed, to make a dialogue with Professor Cheung today. A little disclaimer before I start. I am not an expert in crisis management. Perhaps I'm a layperson in crisis management, nor I have practical experiences in managing crisis in the government. But as a junior academic specializing in political science and philosophy, I would like to elaborate on a point raised by Professor Cheung just now. It is about crisis narratives. And I would like to offer my humble views from a slightly hermeneutic perspective. So These opinion pieces, I think most of you or many of you have seen these before. These opinion pieces went popular for a while in Hong Kong society in February. It was written by a Bloomberg opinion columnist, published in early February. So as you can see from the picture, nothing on the shelves in a supermarket. And I recognize this supermarket might be in somewhere on the Hong Kong island, okay? So panic buying was everywhere in the city, including toilet papers, rides, and sanitizing products, and of course, face masks as well. So scenes with empty shelves in the supermarkets were all the more common. And our government did not seem to be able to control or take control of the situation. The public seemed to have lost trust in the government, that the government would be able to take control of the situation. So the author of these opinion pieces therefore described Hong Kong as showing symptoms of a failed state. Now, this might be a very serious accusation. So because in comparative politics, a failed state refers to a state where the basic needs of people are not met due to the weak, this may be due to the weak governing institutions or deep internal divisions within the government. So my question when I was preparing for this talk was what actually went wrong in Hong Kong? And more specifically, why did a well-modernized Hong Kong become a place comparable to some developing countries like Haiti or Syria, that the term failed state might be often used to describe these countries' situation instead of Hong Kong? So this is my basic motivational question. Okay, to the next slide. So this is a rather complicated graph as portrayed on the screen, but I think we just need to focus on two major points. That is the periods just right after the first instance of the anti-extradition bill protest in June last year, and also compared the figure to the last, well, of course, it was not only the last crisis, but the last mentionable, okay, remarkable crisis in 2003 after SARS. So as you can see from the diagram, in terms of public trust, that the data were obtained by the Hong Kong Public Opinion Research Institute. So in terms of public trust, it is evidence that Hong Kong people have been losing trust in their government. And based on the survey by the Hong Kong Public Opinion Institute, people's trust in the Hong Kong government has dropped tremendously since the first half of 2019. So I think you can just focus on the right-hand side of the diagram, if you can see the right-hand side of the graph here. So in the second half of 2018, the net value of trust was around plus 10%. The figures then decreased to around minus 40% in the second half of 2019, and then minus 60% just in the first 2 months of 2020. So as a comparison, for the periods of SARS in the first half of 2003, as you can see in the middle of the diagram, the net value back then was even higher. That was 12.8%. 12.8%. So we can quickly relate, perhaps many of us can quickly relate the above findings to the two major crises we experienced in the past 9 months. But how can we understand the relationship between crisis management, and most importantly, public trust, as what the survey was trying to demonstrate here? So some literature review. So although I'm not an expert, but it is still good to just go through some seminal readings about crisis management and public trust. So Ansel, Bond, and Tihart, very prominent scholars in researching into crisis management, they suggest 5 core tasks. There are 5 core tasks altogether of political crisis management. So the 5 tasks are making sense of the crisis situation, the first one, how to shape responses, the second, and then how to make meaning out from the crisis, the third one. And the fourth one is to account giving after a crisis, okay? So how you understand the crisis, how you how you handle the crisis, how you provide solutions, like what Professor Cheung mentioned, the practical aspect of crisis management, and eventually learning. So I would like to focus on the middle of the 5 steps, that is meaning making. How political leaders define a crisis in a way that maintains or restores trust in the government. So the 3 scholars here insist that the meaning-making process is important because it is the major components in crisis management process in building public trust or even restoring trust in the government. So they have a rule that here I would like to just do a direct quote. So they said, it is not enough to offer a story. Leaders must get others to accept their definition of the situation. And that is very sensible. A storyline, a narrative is not enough. So the most important point is how the government can come up with a persuasive story that the public would find that acceptable, and there will also be motivations for the public to act accordingly, based on the recommendations in the storyline. So getting the public to accept an official crisis narrative is no easy task. Having said that, because the government is not the only actor in the midst of crisis. There are other actors, political leaders. They are not only the actors trying to define the crisis. There are other actors trying to compete with the political leaders. For example, various party leaders, for example. And then there are also so many key opinion leaders in the society today. And these views can be diffused much more effectively compared to the past. So I guess this is a battleground, a battlefield. So one important message from Ansel, Boynton, and Tihart was that crisis management in terms of meaning making is a competitive, well, may not be gamble, but a competitive task in a competitive domain. So the contestant, they would try to manipulate, strategize, and have their frames accepted as the dominant narrative as well. So the government, what the governments or the political leaders are expected to do would be at least the following 2 tasks. So the first one, they will have to come up with a good story. So they got to think about the storyline. This is the first one. And the second one, more importantly, once they got the storyline, how can they raise against the contenders in shaping public perceptions? Now the key lesson is, if they fail to shape public perceptions, other contenders will. So if this is the case, the public leaders, the governments might lose the battle for the meaning-making activity. So I managed to read the same book as Professor Cheung just now. So it is also a seminal reading in the politics of crisis management, and you can see Boynton and Tihart, as well as 2 other scholars, Stern and Sunderland here. So they discuss how political leaders can communicate crisis narratives in detail, effectively. There was a chapter that summarized many lessons learned from the political leaders handling crisis around the world. So the government must establish, they said it very, very clearly, pointed out very clearly at the start of the chapter, the government must establish credibility. And there are many ways to establish credibility. And the most important one of the most important way is to offer appropriate initial responses. And other examples, they also suggested some other examples, including the crisis rituals, or they have to be skillfully masking some dimensions of crisis and crisis response operations. So this is what I would like to say before the end of my part, is that in trying to build credibility through meaning making, the government must shape public perceptions and emotions. But how can they do this? They will have to work on some sort of symbolic stuff. So That's the concept called symbolic actions. Or you can say they have to engage in framing or the storyline that tries to depoliticize the crisis. So the meaning of depoliticize here is to reduce the political contentions, to make it less antagonist, so that everyone would have the incentive, would be motivated to be unified, to fight the crisis, to handle the crisis, to respond to the crisis. Okay, so I will stop here for the first part. I will hand it over to Professor Cheung to firstly talk about the governance crisis before the COVID pandemic, and then afterwards I will share my views on the governance crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much both for the opening remarks. And now, Professor Cheung, will move to the most recent crisis Hong Kong has experienced, the anti-extradition law controversies last year. Professor Cheung, please.
Okay. I guess the audience is well familiar with what happened from last year due to the protests against the extradition bill amendment. And then the crisis later on evolved into a crisis for the whole government, which is indeed a governance crisis. Now, I'm not going through all the details of that few months or almost a year now, but let's focus on some major points. First, the nature of the conflict. At the beginning, as far as the government was concerned, it was about improving, in quotation, the arrangements for extradition, because all along, Hong Kong did not have any extradition arrangement with the mainland and with Taiwan. And it was a murder case that happened in Taiwan involving Hong Kong permanent residents, which sort of accounted for why government would like to make the legislative amendments. So government regarded that as a legal matter, or a need to sort of fill the gap left behind by the past. However, as what Professor Wong said earlier by way of introduction, in any crisis, there are bound to be various contenders, various actors, political actors. It's not just the government, but legislators, parties, the community, media, commentators, even academics. And they all try to define and frame the issue. And they may frame and define the issue in different ways. Not necessarily out of sinister motives, but the way they look at things. Now, if looking back, in my view, it was a bit premature for government to try to deal with the Taiwan murder case by way of doing something drastic about the extradition matter. Why? Because the whole reason why Hong Kong all along has not been able to establish a set of extradition arrangements with Taiwan and also with the mainland ever since British rule. The whole reason was these are special cases which normal international extradition agreements, arrangements between sovereign states cannot apply. For Hong Kong and the mainland, we belong to the same country. So naturally, we said, what's the difficulty? But we are talking about one country, two systems, two very different systems, regulated by the basic law. For Hong Kong and Taiwan, it's not just between Hong Kong and Taiwan as sort of political jurisdictions, but more importantly, Taiwan and the mainland are in a very delicate, what we call cross-strait set of relationships, very sensitive, and animosities and some degree of cooperation coexist. So therefore, from day one, the matter is not just a legal issue, or it's not just a matter of simply adopting international template, but a very specific political issue. So that's why when the proposal came out early last year, immediately some critics or opposition politicians, pro-democracy camp, they will relate that to the prospect of one country, two systems. They would frame the issue as a matter to do with freedom, autonomy. And looking back, I think it would be fair to suggest that government had underestimated the political sensitivity of the matter. And that's why, and if government communication failed to address that concern, eventually you can imagine ordinary people will become worried. That's why this they framed this proposal, 反送中, anti sort of sending people to the mainland. And if that was the crux of the matter, I think government at that time had either to really address that concern strongly and take away anxiety, or if that is not possible, government should have taken the opportunity to accept a setback and sort of take the opportunities of reversal, reconciliation, and then repair by withdrawing the bill. However, I think government had missed several important opportunities in May, in June, and the subsequent couple of months. And because eventually the anti-extradition movement became a series of confrontations involving violence as well, and therefore the police stepped in. And now it's not fair for us here in this seminar to really discuss who's right and who's wrong, but the crux of the matter is the critics' attention then turned to the police and turned to the government as a whole. So eventually the movement has become a movement against the police, against the government. And by refusing to set up a commission of inquiry, there's no way for our society to really find out who's right and who's wrong, because the truth are not fully established. And there's no channel to really sort out all the differences to establish the facts. So in a way, the crisis is still brewing and becoming more serious. And it is no longer a narrow law and order issue. It is a political issue. And because we don't have a way to sort of achieve a breakthrough, we are not talking about a revolution or suppression per se. So between revolution and suppression, what is the solution? I think that is something that the whole of Hong Kong is facing. But the crisis has mutated from a very sort of legalistic matter about extradition mechanism to a governance crisis against police, against the Lam administration. Hong Kong has turned into a city of rebellion, if you use international comparison. And the government's trustworthiness is at stake. I think this is a very serious governance crisis. At the moment, of course, because of the epidemic issue, attention tends to focus on how to fight the coronavirus. But I would say that once that epidemic is sort of over for the time being, then the governance crisis, again, will be the center of our attention. So some consequences already seen. in terms of the political crisis getting more serious, getting deeper. Radicalization and violent confrontations mainstreamed. I use the word mainstreamed because in the past, nobody would imagine that protests, even protests against the government, would turn violent. The last time we have a serious challenge of government legislation, the Article 23 legislation on national security in 2003, 500,000 people took to the street, peaceful, no violence. In fact, at that time, the international media commended Hong Kong for having peaceful mass marches. So the word peaceful was emphasized. But these days, whenever we have protests, we cannot avoid violence. So that is something new and something really worrying. And in the process of the last few months, many moderates, even non-political citizens, have become agitated or politicized. The younger generation, if we believe the communication over the social media and public opinion polls, many of them, or most of them, have turned against the government and the police. And that is worrying for any government. Last November, we have the district council elections. And we all know that the Democratic camp, the anti-government candidates, they had landslide victory. And this is an electoral sea change. And if that kind of sea change repeats in the coming electoral election in September, then it's really a major milestone in Hong Kong's political landscape. A crisis for Beijing. The top officials in charge of Hong Kong and Macau affairs have been reshuffled. I think as far as Beijing is concerned, the prospect of one country, two systems is a risk. For the SAR, for the Carrie Lam administration, of course, because of the very low level of public support and confidence in the government, that has handicapped the current efforts to fight the COVID-19 virus. So we are now in the midst of political impasse and deadlock. As far as the situation is concerned, up to now, the end of the tunnel is not seen. There's no way forward. Now, I mentioned the Article 23 crisis in 2003. Now, that was a major political challenge, protest against government legislation that relates to sort of two systems arrangement. Now, what could we learn from that crisis? That crisis was about Hong Kong having to legislate on its own on national security. It is a constitutional duty, but of course there are different ways of doing it. At that time, the government chose to, in my view, a very ambitious route by having an omnibus legislation. And the net was cast too wide, so that many ordinary people felt threatened. They were worried about the loss of their individual freedoms. And the government at that time failed to secure strategic stakeholder buy-in, particularly the legal sector. Communication was weak. Government was not able to really address the concerns of ordinary people. And government underestimated public reaction. They thought, well, we are legislating in accordance with the basic law. It is a constitutional duty. But for others, they worry about the loss of freedoms. So how can government be effective in addressing that concern and explain why freedom is not the issue? I think at that time, government was not able to do so. And because of Hong Kong's political system, you may argue that we suffered an inherent defect in terms of low political trust. But that has not always been the case. Earlier, Professor Wong showed us the graph. Sometimes we are doing quite well. And in terms of political trust, sometimes when we compare Hong Kong with other countries, we are not really that terrible. So there are various factors that will affect the framing or the contention among different players in framing and defining the issue. But looking back to last year, the anti-extradition bill issue, I think government probably has not fully learned from the bitter lesson of the Article 23 crisis. Okay, the final slide on this part. So what lessons can be learned so far out of the governance crisis? Because the crisis is still going on, it may become worse. Hopefully it will become, it can be handled eventually. So a few points I would like to make. First, the government should think what and how ordinary people think, whether or not they are right or wrong, whether or not they have get the whole truth. But you have, for government, for you to effectively address the concerns, unless you know how they think, what they are thinking about, and avoid bureaucratic or legalistic thinking, avoid narrow thinking, avoid groupthink. Is politics stupid? Now, this is not my comment on the government, but this is a comment frequently made by people that this is about politics. So, because any crisis is about politics. But the question is, whose politics? Now, in this case, because we are talking about the future of one country, two systems. Now, for the chief executive is caught in a kind of tension between two systems. The chief executive constitutionally is accountable to both Beijing as the central government and also to the Hong Kong SAR. So there are two masters, so to speak. So the two masters may have two different sets of politics. So how do you square these two sets of politics? Are you serving two masters or just one master? Now that is a challenge. And public trust decides, very true. If government enjoys a good level of public trust, people would tend to believe what government says. They would tend to give government, and in this case, also the central government, the benefit of the doubt. But if trust is low, they will not give you benefit of doubt. They will engage in all kinds of conspiracy theory, fearing the worst, fearing the most sinister motives. And finally, the point about crisis mutation. So you can see that originally it was a legal matter, and then eventually became a governance crisis. And bystanders, meaning people who were originally unattached, non-attached to the crisis, or who felt that they were not affected, eventually bystanders, people who just watch, they became adversary. They became very concerned. I think that is a very important signal of a crisis, governance crisis looming large. And there are even cracks within the establishment camp. So far, the lessons learned, they are very bitter lessons. And we have not seen light at the end of the tunnel. So let's hope that the government, the whole society could take these lessons seriously.
Okay, thank you, Professor Cheung. And Dr. Wong, please.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you once again to Professor Cheung for his insightful review on the governance crisis associated with the extradition bill controversy. Now, in this part, let me elaborate on 2 points just mentioned by Professor Cheung. The 2 points about, well, you might actually remember just from the last slide, what and how ordinary people think, as well as the cracks within establishment. So what I'm going to talk about are associated with these 2 points. So I will offer 2 stories of face masks, okay, and to look at how the society thought differently from the government and why there were divisions even within supporters, supporting camps for the government. So to get started, the first story of masks took place last year in the second part of 2019. I think the background I don't need to talk too much about the background. So the background was basically related to the protests and social unrest, and also the violence involved in the social unrest and protest, presumably from July 2019. So the government, in order to reduce violence and other criminal behavior associated with the protests, it established the prohibition of face covering regulation under the Emergency Regulations Ordinance in early October 2019. So the introduction of what we call the anti-mask law was met with, ironically, further controversy, further confrontations, and protests. So to approach the matter from a more hermeneutic perspective, I would like to ask this question: what does it mean? So we are talking about meaning making, right? What does it mean by covering up one's face during a protest? So the context is very important during a protest. And back then, for the government, of course, it was not something good. It was a signal of threat to its governance. It was a signal of threat to the city's overall stability and prosperity. And the reason, okay, so they saw that those who concealed their identities with masks, they were able to commit crimes and escape justice. So that was the official discourse. And to end violence, restore justice, in exact wordings, exact wordings, the anti-mask laws were considered as a really rational response, okay, from the point of view of trying to suppress violence, and assuming that the anti-mask law itself, by stopping people concealing their identities, will really minimize the incentives for committing crimes and escape justice. Then this is kind of a very sensible storyline. But the point is, the narrative was not existing in a vacuum. It was challenged by a number of counter-narratives in society. Now, I'm sure in the following slides, some of you will be able to recognize these narratives. So the first counter-narrative was about rights. And this narrative was mainly shared or initiated or disseminated by people who were basically against the government or actually on the democratic side. So according to this narrative, people have a right to privacy, and such that they could participate in politics without the fear of discrimination and revenge. Now notice that the fear of discrimination and revenge did not necessarily come from the surveillance of governments. They were not just concerned about being arrested, okay, just in case they broke the law during the protest. But it was also related to the positions that they took versus or vis-a-vis the positions of their employers. So there was a narrative to say that, well, people should be able to cover up their identities, not because they want to escape from legal responsibility, but they would like to participate in politics as in their personal capacity, instead of being recognized by their bosses, by their supervisors, by their employers. And if the employers or their bosses didn't like or didn't think their political positions were appropriate, then they might be facing discrimination at workplace or maybe fired, okay? So this is one of the discourse by the pro-democratic side, so focusing more on the rights of the protesters. Another narrative, the deterrence narrative. So people who engage in protest violence would not find it costly to violate the anti-mask law altogether. So it was basically the effectiveness question. If you would like to target at those protesters who decided to break the law anyway. So according to this narrative, you wouldn't have enough incentive to stop them from wearing masks. Anyway, according to this narrative, the sentence that these protesters that are going to serve might be not so comparable, okay, with the sentences or the punishments or the legal consequence from the other violent actions or maybe illegal behavior in the protesters. So according to this narrative, it is not effective. The means itself is not effective. The third narrative, the procedure. So based on this narrative, it is not a matter of the anti-mask law, but how the anti-mask law should be made, should be enacted. So the law should not be based on the emergency regulations ordinance, but instead follow the regular legislative procedures. And there was also the last narrative. Now remember, last year, the second half of the 2019, the anti-extradition law protests was not only about the legal matters, as Professor Cheung mentioned. It was a political matter, and then later the blame was kind of shifted to the government and also the police. So in the midst of the struggles between the protesters and the government and also the police, so the police were allowed to wear masks. And then some protesters, they have been complaining about the difficulty of identifying some police officers who might have already violated some sort of regulations in implementing when they're discharging their duties. So if their identities were not traceable for complaints, so that might be an issue for people. So it's more about the fairness of the means of the anti-mask law. So if you compare the four narratives, the first rights narrative, it was about a question. It was a question about the justifiability of the means itself. So how justified is the anti-mask law? And if you look at the second narrative, it was a question about the effectiveness of the means. So the means itself might not be problematic, but we are talking about whether you can produce the desired ends from the means. And then the third narrative, it was a question about the urgency of the means. Was it really that urgent that we have to bypass all the regular procedures and then to accept this kind of emergency ordinance in the first place? And then the last one, as I said, it was about the equity issue. And this equity issue was in high stake at that moment, while the protesters were trying to focus on the government and the police rather than the extradition bill itself. Right. And one more point, if you look at these narratives were not only shared by protesters or what we call the anti-establishment camps people. Some of these narratives were also shared by people within the pro-establishment camp. So from the list, you might be able to recall the deterrence narrative, the procedure narratives. They were once upon a time pointed out by legislators that were not identified as pro-democrat at least, okay? So they were more often identified as pro-establishment. So from here, we can see that even the counter-narratives, there are some sort of divisions within the pro-government or pro-establishment camp. If you see these narratives in place in the society and compare with the official narrative, you can basically see that these four narratives were trying to challenge the official narrative from different dimensions. So to sum up the last slide for this part, so soon after the announcement of the anti-mask law, a group of pan-democratic legislators, they filed a judicial review against the law. And then we continue to witness violence and non-violent protests, and we would never forget about how the November, how violence or actually how tense the situations were in November, especially on university campuses. And then in mid-November 2019, the Court of First Instance of the High Court ruled that the anti-mask law was actually incompatible with the basic law. But then a few days later, the government decided to appeal against the court's decision. What I would like to say to wrap up this session is, in just the first part of this talk, the meaning of mask wearing was politicized. That means wearing a mask is not only wearing a mask. It is more than that. So there were political signals. So you were sending political signals to the government, to others. You were kind of protesting. You would like to conceal your identities. So it had become a domain of contention, a domain of political contention. So I will once again stop here. And later, when we look at the second part of the story of Moses, we might be able to see something a little bit different later, okay? But now I think we can open up for some Q&A or discussions, right?
Thank you, James, for the insights. And now, before we move to the second half of the seminar, as I said at the beginning, we'll leave 15 minutes for Q&A. So, okay, Professor, please.
Thank you very much, Alex, for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. So I would like to, ask a question about the linkage between, this social, unrest, and and also the controversies regarding to extradition law bill, and this current fight against coronavirus. Yeah, I think to what extent I wonder, the social unrest is actually have a significant bearing in terms of the option that the government, the Hong Kong government, is able to choose, right? So in what way that because we've just experienced this, actually somehow have certain impact on their choice and also on effectiveness of their approach. I'd like to ask this for the two panelists.
Okay, let me respond first. Even though we haven't gone into the next part, which is about the COVID-19 virus issue, but given what we have said so far, in any crisis management situation, government needs to have a good level. I would not say high level, because most government do not enjoy high level of public trust, but a good level of public trust that can enable the government story to be taken seriously and hopefully to be accepted. So there is a joint effort between government and people to deal with the epidemic. But because of what happened since last year, the government had very low level of public trust and support. And therefore, whatever story, whatever narrative or message coming out from government became seriously distrusted, disputed. And then people began to have all kinds of conspiracy about the government. And any effort or any steps taken by the government, which did not meet the expectation, which was not in line with what some sectors of society would like to see, people would tend to think, okay, is that because there is a political motive? Is it because government was under central government pressure, for example, over the issue of border closure? So I would say that if there was no governance crisis, so if whatever happened since last year had not happened, and if this virus crisis was the first crisis faced by Hong Kong, maybe given the efforts that have gone into it from government and from the rest of society, maybe people would have become more trusting. They would be more in line. They would be able to be on the side of government so that we fight the epidemic together, really together.
Okay. So I basically agree with Professor Cheung's viewpoint. I don't have a lot to add here. So, so I will also continue to tell the second part of the story, which will illustrate actually Professor Wu's point. So how the governance crisis actually pose a barrier for the governments of mobilizing people in handling the COVID-19 crisis. So my point, to just give you some sort of overview before we jump to the second part, is that, so from the literature I mentioned, so about crisis management, one effective way of handling crisis would be to depoliticize the crisis. But from the extraditional social unrest, extraditional controversy, the crisis was a little bit different from the COVID-19. So back then, in the extraditional case, some sort of people were kind of dissatisfied with the police, with the governments. So the government was one of the major targets to blame by the people. So back then, the government was incentivized to avoid unifying people. And one of the measures in formulating the discourse, or one of the ways that they formulate the discourse, would be to politicize even the mask wearing behavior. So, but then later we will see that in the handling the COVID-19, what was needed was not a politicized narrative, but a depoliticized narrative that aims to unite people to fight the virus together. So basically, the politicization of the mask wearing will later become a burden, become something costly to the government to once again go back to the mask wearing issues when they wanted to depoliticize the mask wearing narrative. But it would be a little bit too difficult because they have already politicized mask wearing in the first place. Okay, so this is my very brief response to Professor Wu's question.
All right, okay, thank you. We actually collected a question from the chat box. The question was, does the protest last year mean that the Hong Kong public has lost their trust in the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I think this question could be answered at two levels. Historically, you might say that the population in Hong Kong, I'm mainly referring to the sort of local Chinese population, they tended not to really trust the Communist Party, because we all know that the population in Hong Kong since the Second World War, since the 1980s, have been largely made of refugees from the mainland. Some of them political refugees. So therefore, it's sort of common knowledge, and I think the CCP leadership in Beijing, they knew that very well. Deng Xiaoping said, we don't need Hong Kong people to support the Communist Party. You can be anti-Communist Party, but so long as you are patriotic, that's fine. So that is the whole reason why you have two systems, one country, two systems. So socialism on the mainland and capitalism in Hong Kong. Of course, it all depends on how you define socialism and how you define capitalism. That historical background explains why we have the two systems arrangement, why there was the historical compromise over Hong Kong's return to the motherland in 1907. But putting that aside, I think since the reunification, there have been new tensions in terms of practice of one country, two systems on both sides. And because of the issue of democracy, because of the concern about possible loss of freedom or autonomy, and then on the part of the mainland, it was also concerned about Hong Kong sort of ignoring the importance of national security, national sovereignty. So you have concerns of both sides. And therefore, these all played into the sentiment, which I noticed in Hong Kong, of emphasizing the Hong Kong identity, the local identity. And as we know, internationally, identity politics is so prevalent across the world. So in terms of the latest wave of identity politics, and I would say that that is also very much targeted on the practice of socialism, CCP rule on the mainland. So indeed, yes, what happened over the last year or so definitely had to do with the sentiments towards the Communist Party.
I just have a very brief remark. Once again, I also agree very much what Professor Cheung responded to the question. So to my own will, okay, in order to respond to the question whether public don't believe in the Communist Party. Now, I would say it is more about the matter whether the Hong Kong government or the chief executive. I think Hong Kong people are more concerned about whether the government or the chief executive is actually doing something that takes care of the interests of Hong Kong people. Now, of course, there is an assumption that the interests of Hong Kong people might be different from the interests of the Communist Party or people in the mainland. So I think your question may be motivated by kind of this assumption, okay? There exists a difference between the interests of the people in two different territories, or even the Hong Kong people's interests would be different from the Communist Party's interests. And to echo one of the points suggested by Professor Cheung, the chief executives, this position itself is really difficult to master because of the dual responsibility, dual accountability. You are on the one hand accountable to the central government, of the PRC, on the other hand, you are accountable to the Hong Kong people. So, when Hong Kong people sense that there might be a chance that Hong Kong people's interests might be sacrificed, okay, in order to satisfy or fulfill some of the expectations by the Communist Party or the central government, they would have questioned about the legitimacy of the Hong Kong government and also the chief executive.
All right, we have collected 2 more questions from the chat box, but unfortunately, due to limited time, so probably we'll go through them very quickly.
Yes.
From our friends from Lingnan and Dr. Hui, that I think all of you know. Johnny, go up, please. The first, yes, Vincent. There's a narrative that Hong Kong society and citizens do well to maintain a stable status during health crisis. So
I think we can handle this question in the second part. So we will get back to that.
Yeah, so Vincent, sorry, we'll basically respond to your question later on in the second half.
Yes.
All right, and next from Glenn.
Okay, maybe later part.
Okay, so and the third one is more related to the anti-extradition law crisis.
Freedom.
How can a government manage a crisis which has roots in fundamental values such as freedom?
Maybe just a very brief response to that. As we all know, freedom is not absolute.
Yes.
I mean, right now, facing the coronavirus, people's movements are being restricted. City lockdowns. So to that extent, you may argue that freedom is being constrained. Of course, there's a good reason for doing that. So I think the challenge to government in a crisis like what we have faced over the last year or so is not just a matter of freedom being protected or being restricted. It has to do with the context of what you do and the implications for freedom, whether any policy or any measure has struck the right balance between freedom and other major concerns of our society for both short-term need and longer-term benefit. So it's about balancing, in my view.
Yes, and my brief response to that would be, of course, it's easier said than done. But in principle, on the one hand, of course, we can focus a lot on freedom, political freedom, or personal freedom. But as a matter of fact, in a society, there are so many different values that are valuable, that are treasurable by the people. So I think one principle that the government then takes reference from would be to highlight, as Professor Cheung also mentioned, the trade-offs, okay? How can we balance between different values? So on the one hand, we might have to sacrifice a little bit of freedom, but on the other hand, we may make the society overall happier or safer. So from a more utilitarian perspective, we can actually offer justification or a more justified narrative about constraining just a little bit of personal freedom in return for the greater safety and security of the society. I think these kind of narrative exist or have been existing in the world for a long time, even in the Western liberal societies when they decided to push forward the anti-terrorism policy, they imposed the restrictions on the security at the airport, travels. So they also advocate this kind of perspective. Okay, so it is not only about the matter of freedom, but it is also about how you market the alternative values. So when you sacrifice the freedom, what you get in return.
Yep. Okay, thank you both. Due to time limit, I'm afraid we have to move to the second half of the seminar on, so both speakers will talk explicitly on the COVID-19 crisis. Professor Cheung, please.
Okay, now we come to the COVID-19 epidemic crisis. Now this is a crisis still going on, and we cannot yet see the end of the crisis or all the consequences. Although I think it would be fair to say that the overall implication of this epidemic would be more serious than what we have been witnessing so far. So fingers crossed. Now, this part, I would like, first of all, to look at how Hong Kong performs, and then to take into consideration the more global picture, so that we can examine crisis management in Hong Kong in a proper perspective. Now, within Hong Kong, I think we all know what's been going on, because everybody probably has been following the news every day. I would say that overall, Hong Kong has done well compared to other places. And the potential risk from the new coronavirus was not ignored. But of course, there's argument in some quarters as to whether government could have acted earlier and acted more stringently. Now that could be debated, and it depends on later on when we review the whole saga with the benefit of additional information, then we can make more conclusive judgment. But just let us put it here, that emergency response, the highest level of response, was activated on the 25th of January this year, 2 days after the first 2 infection cases were confirmed. So as far as that part is concerned, it was quite efficient. I would not say the government has delayed in action. But of course, before the 25th of January, some experts might question the government, whether the government should have acted even earlier, whether the government should have acted earlier based on the kind of information, probably not official, but there's a lot of intelligence from the experts regarding the situation in Wuhan. Once government started acting, the post-SARS SOP has been followed, and we have seen very smooth implementation, rather efficient. As far as that part of crisis management concerned, I think we have done very well. And we must give credit to our public health and hospital professionals, medics, paramedics, nursing staff. I think overall their competence, their efficiency cannot be questioned. But of course, their surge capacity is still limited. In other words, if the crisis worsened, then there's a point where we need to be concerned about. And there's also the concern about the tight supply of PPE, the personal protective equipment, masks, and so forth. So post-SARS SOP, fine. experts may still have most experts, they agree on broad things, but I can detect there's still a margin of differences. For example, between those doctors who are within the government's consultative circle and those who are not, or between academic doctors and doctors in the field. Dissatisfaction and discontent over various measures, containment, closure, including the matter of border closure, closure of schools, where you locate the testing centers, where you locate the quarantine centers, so on and so forth, the lack of masks. Now, with the benefit of what has happened over the last couple of months, everywhere, I would say that such kind of dissatisfaction and discontent happens everywhere, in Australia, in London, in US. It's a kind of hiccups, it's a kind of challenges that no government can be immune from. So the question is, if you detect that kind of dissatisfaction, discontent, whether you can communicate better to address the concerns. But I think that kind of challenge cannot be avoided. Now, the virus, many would say that Hong Kong, Singapore have benefited a lot, have done well, have benefited a lot because they have learned from the SARS crisis in 2003. Indeed, Hong Kong went through very bitter experience. There were 3 inquiries after the SARS crisis by the government, by the hospital authority, and also by the Legislative Council. We have learned a lesson. And a few lessons learned, and here I sort of highlight them so that we know. Risk assessment. Because in 2003, SARS was a new virus. At the beginning, nobody knew what it was. So it was treated simply as a typical pneumonia. And therefore, people were less sensitive, less alert to the threat. And it was also underestimated because of the traditional epidemiological way of assessment. And therefore, we are caught sort of off guard. And during that crisis, there was not sufficient readiness in terms of response, insufficient search capacity, lack of coordination between various departments. It was discovered that there was sort of tension between the Policy Bureau and the Department of Health, and sort of different agencies or even different hospitals, they may not be acting in unison, confused implementation of infection control, delayed decisions on the infection control measures, school closures, quarantine, so on and so forth. Communication was unsatisfactory, public panic. Now, all these, I think, you may say that had given Hong Kong a lot of good lessons, and therefore this time, risk assessment, capacity to respond, coordination, or in terms of decisions on infection control, I think we have done much better. Communication, I think, is both a tick and only a part of a tick. A tick in the sense that every day we have a press briefing by the Department of Health. I think Dr. Cheung should be credited for that. Very clear, plain explanation of what is happening. We have been given figures, both at the press briefing and also on the website of the government. However, the crisis narrative, in my view, is weak and inadequate. Yeah. Now, Hong Kong has done well, although there's a lot of local misgivings, but overall, internationally, overseas, our performance is commended. And of course, we're now facing the second wave of the challenge when the virus has become a pandemic. Now, in terms of crisis narrative, I said inadequate, weak, because in any narrative, government has to really explain what is the kind of crisis that we are facing. And you cannot explain that simply by medical terms. You have to explain it in a way ordinary people can understand. What is the crisis? What is the risk to health? What is the risk to their daily living? Right? How daily living might be disrupted? And what is the government going to do? The government's strategy to mitigate the crisis, the priorities, or the kind of steps taken by government, and why? If freedom movements are to be restricted, why? For what good reason? The people, ordinary people, needs clear messaging on what to do. So what to do is the most important. Not what government would do, but what ordinary people would do, what they have to do. It's insufficient just for the doctors to say, well, the best way is for you to have to wear masks, you have abundant masks at home, you have to change your mask every day or every half a day. It's not sufficient because the fact is there is not sufficient supply of masks. And people will get very anxious, very worried. So government has to really, based on the actual situation, to craft this crisis narrative. And the shortage of strategic supplies, panic, public reaction, I think these are very important elements which government probably was initially not fully prepared for. And because of the ongoing social unrest and political unrest, therefore crisis leadership of the government has been hampered. The experts take over. But the fact that experts, the medical experts that are taking over, is not something unique to Hong Kong. It's the same in other places as well. I also would like to mention the stimulus package that is needed. And this is happening elsewhere, because we are not just fighting an epidemic war, we're also fighting a war against economic recession or even depression. And therefore, any stimulus package from the government has to really address the supply shocks and demand shocks of this looming global economic recession. The Financial Secretary has announced some measures in his budget speech last month. And I think looking at the situation now, probably we need more stimulus proposals from the government. And this is a time where we have to really treasure our bullets. We cannot spend money too easily. All the expenditure by government in terms of stimulus package has to be focused, had to be really geared towards the real questions, to protect jobs, to sustain company businesses, to keep consumption. Otherwise, there will be a vicious cycle. Now, this is what we are in, the whole world. We're so worried, everybody's so worried. Now, just go through the slide. These are some of the lessons regarded by BBC News as lessons to be learned by the West from Asia. Now, lesson 1, take the crisis seriously and act quickly. Lesson 2, make tests extensive, affordable. Lesson 3, trace and isolate. Lesson 4, early social distancing. I think Hong Kong by and large have been doing very well in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4. Lesson 5, keep the public well informed and on side. I think on this, because of the problems regarding crisis narrative that I just mentioned, probably we are not doing as well as we should be. Lesson 6 is also down to individual attitudes. Indeed, in any crisis regarding health hazards, natural hazards, individual attitudes are very important. And I think because of the SARS experience, Hong Kong has been doing that quite well. Ordinary people, they are sufficiently sensitive to the risk. Now, earlier I mentioned because government's leadership has been hampered, therefore experts take over or have taken over. But we should not imagine that experts can solve all the problems. Now here I cite some literature on the issue. This book by Peter Curzon, and he said by the way, he's a medical geographer. And he said in his 2015 book on deadly encounters based on Australian and other places' experience, and he asked the question, should politicians just step aside and let the doctors do all the talking? I mean, that's the real question. And he said that, yes, most of the time governments would rely heavily on the medical profession in addressing epidemics, but he said, rarely did they understand how ordinary people respond to such threat, how they regard risks and are influenced by the people around them and how the media would present information. And if you look at Hong Kong, indeed, the ordinary people, they do not just receive information from the Express, they trust the Express. But at the same time, they get all kinds of messages, or some good ones, some fake messages, fake news over social media. And they're affected by the sentiments of people around them. And sometimes these elements may not be fully understood by the experts, because the experts, they have their own set of frame in looking at things. So therefore, we have to recognize that in any such hazard, there are many factors that have to be taken into account. And that's what makes crisis management so challenging. Across the world, just highlight the current situation. Earlier, there is this tension or tussle between whether we should opt for suppression or mitigation, more laid back, as in the case of the UK. But now I think most countries have geared towards stringent suppression, lockdowns, closures. The tension between science and politics. Science is more defined. Politics could be much more complicated. And scientific issues can be weaponized for partisan competition, for international politics. US-China battles over the virus, lack of global coordination, unlike the global financial crisis 10 years ago. Now each fighting on its own. The two Ps, pandemic versus panic, fear of the unknown. So when people laughed a couple months ago about Hong Kong, panic buying in supermarkets, toilet papers, every country, virtually every country has done the same. So this panic is universal. One element, in my view, has been underestimated throughout this crisis is the rich-poor divide due to under this containment measures. When you lock down a city, when you restrict people's movement, when you ask all the shops to close, well, what about the poor? What about the very ordinary grassroots employees? How do they get their living? And I think that's a key issue that we should not underestimate. Discriminations and racism, I think we have enough media report on that. The question is, can fear justify demonizing? Diverse expert views. The advice from WHO, in my view, the advice of WHO was too conservative at the beginning. I think WHO underestimated the risk. The limitation of surge capacity. Right now, every country is opting for suppression, okay? But once we have reached the limit of the surge capacity, I think that's going to pose a new challenge. And some countries in Italy, in other places, they've already reached that situation. So that's why most countries have said, okay, social distancing, city lockdowns, restrictions of movements, even in India, national lockdown. In Malaysia, national lockdown. The question really is, if this COVID-19 crisis, virus is so different from SARS, it's going to last for a much longer time. Can we lock down cities? Can we lock down a country continuously? Not just for 2 weeks, not just for a month, but for several months. What would happen politically, economically, socially? I think that is the major threat that we are now facing. The crisis has become a larger social crisis and an economic crisis. And can we continue like that? Now, I will be quick on this because things are still evolving, fighting the virus and fighting economic slump amid uncertainties. According to the way The Economist magazine described it, the world economy has been turned upside down. Stock markets collapsed by a third up to the 18th of March. According to JP Morgan, global GDP this year will be having a negative growth rate of minus 1.1, and that's very serious, the worst since the global financial crisis. Massive government intervention is needed, and indeed many countries have come up with bold stimulus packages. According to The Economist, by the middle of March, several countries, US, Germany, UK, France, Italy together, have promised stimulus up to an equivalent of 23% of GDP. But the consequence is public debt will soar, and there will be very serious consequential economic implications. The US Fed has announced unlimited QE. Now, it's necessary perhaps right now, but the longer term consequences have yet to be seen. The trade-off between mitigation and suppression, right now, I think most governments have opted for suppression, whatever the cost. But if the virus persists, can we still just stick to suppression? Are people prepared for a long war with huge human, social, and economic costs? Now, this challenge perhaps right now is more imminent for countries like UK, other European countries, the US, Australia. But Hong Kong should not be complacent. We might face any spill-off from that challenge as well. So maybe I'll stop here before we answer some questions later on.
Okay, James, please.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Professor Cheung. And as time is running short, I would keep my part short as possible. And in this part, I'm going to elaborate on one point, again, suggested by Professor Cheung. One of the points suggested by him was the governments rarely understand how ordinary people respond to epidemic. And by highlighting or painting the second story of face masks, we will again be able to see how people in society might think differently from the government. So the second story of masks, this is to continue from the first story from last year. So during the COVID-19 epidemic, so it broke out in mainland China, in Hong Kong in late January 2020. So it was a little bit of tricky time because the anti-mask law appeal was still in process. So this context is very important. And apart from issues on border closure, quarantine centers, there was also a controversy over the shortage of face mask supply, needless to say. And if you just have a look at the picture on the right-hand side, I think if you recall many of the participants here, the memories, the rather negative memories about purchasing enough face masks for your own use, for your family's use, or maybe for your kids, okay, for the elderly. So one of the reasons why the people were trying to search for masks, both locally and globally, so we managed to search for masks on the internet from different parts of the world. And then, of course, you remember the rather funny phrase, okay, called the 2 boxes thanks, 1 box thanks, okay, on Facebook, on social media. So one of the reasons was the government did not try to regulate the sales and purchases of face masks in the market. And most people in Hong Kong were left desperate to search for the protective equipment, so as minimal as a face mask. Now, the puzzle is the following. Now, what does it mean by covering one's face during the epidemic? So in comparison with covering up one's face during the protest. So of course, for the government, they said it is not necessary to wear face masks unless one has symptoms flu, for example, or have to take care of a person with suspected infection. One important point is this narrative is actually quite consistent with the guidelines of the World Health Organization, or is also consistent with many governments in the West, okay, in the liberal West countries. So why did Hong Kong people feel bad about, or actually negative about, this narrative? So as you can recall from the experience, how the public reacted to this government's narrative. It was challenged, similar to the first story of mosque. It was challenged. This official narrative was challenged by a number of counter narratives in the society. So the first narrative that I identified would be the incompetence narrative. That's the name I use. So in this narrative, the government was seen to restrict civil servants from wearing masks, for example, because they failed to procure enough masks through competitive tendering. If you remember what the government tried to do in order to purchase more masks, they just follow the standard, the same competitive tendering procedure, while the supply of masks was very, very tense, okay, globally. So one of the criticisms from the civil society was about whether the government should still be using the same set of competitive tendering procedure in order to purchase these these kind of protective equipments in rather short supply. So it goes to the question of efficacy in the first place. So according to this narrative, the government said, you just need to wear a mask if you show symptoms of the relevant symptoms. But then there might be some sort of conspiracy in return in the society. So you said that just because you were unable to secure enough masks just for your own employees in the government. So it's a question about efficacy. And the other narrative was about transparency, the opacity narrative, that's what I call. So some face masks produced by the Correctional Services Department, by the government, were found to be sold in the market. But why these masks were available in the market for sales, it remained largely a mystery. So it is still under investigation, we suppose. So another question about transparency. So the third narrative was about compassion, sympathy, the head in the clouds narrative, or in Cantonese we call it 離地, okay. So the senior officials, they simply did not understand people's struggles in their everyday life. Just to recall one example, so one of the senior officials, principal officials, so he mentioned once upon a time that I have never used face masks for 22 days. Okay, I have been driving to work. I have my own office. I had lunches and dinner on my own. So, but this kind of narrative might be too distant from everyday experience of the people. So not everyone could afford the luxury of driving. So they might still have to take public transport to work. They had no choice of remaining at home for work. They may not even have their own office space of their own. So it is largely about the question of empathy or compassion. So the last narrative, the conspiracy theory, the government discouraged people from wearing masks as the anti-mask law was ongoing. So it was basically related to the first story, okay, whether there was a question of hidden agenda behind. So considering all these four narratives, similarly, you will see that these narratives were sometimes advocated, supported, echoed, even by people within the pro-establishment. So this is a point that I would like to highlight, echoing Professor Cheung's saying. So there might be cracks, okay, even within the governing coalition, the pro-establishment camp. And if you just look at these narratives closer. They are trying to politicize what the government's official narratives intends to do. So the government has been trying to depoliticize the meaning of mask wearing in response to the epidemic. But on the other hand, in the civil society, or maybe even in the international society, the global media, so they were very much aware of what actually happened a few months before the breakout of the epidemic. So on the other hand, it appears that this politicized storyline about mask wearing was still existing. This storyline continued from 2019. And that's why we were able to see a headline like this, for example, by CNN World. It was very eye-catching. Ironically, last year, Carrie Lam banned face masks. Now she is wearing one in the press conference. So with this setting, with this context, whatever the government says about mask wearing in response to the epidemic, so don't panic, you don't have to wear the mask all the time. And even for my employee in the civil service, if they wear a mask, if they don't show symptoms, I will ask them to remove it. So whatever you say, the civil society, there will be counter discourses that try to doubt the credibility of your recommendation. So what I would like to say to wrap up this part would be the tension between the politicization and depoliticization frames about mask wearing. And if fighting virus requires the collective action, the government fails to mobilize the collectives to act accordingly. But of course, there remains a paradox. Why, as Professor Cheung said, the outcomes of virus fighting has not been that bad at all, okay, comparatively speaking, like in many parts of the world. So I will talk a little bit more about this point in the conclusion, in the overview part. So I think for the while, we may open up the floor for discussion for some questions.
Yeah, all right, okay, thank you very much for the great insights. And the discussion has become increasingly heated as we collected more questions in the chat box. So if I'm not mistaken, there are at least 8 questions, including the 2 left over from last round, from Glenn and Vincent. So Joni, could you please go up first? And then we'll collect all the questions and try to answer them in groups.
Yeah.
Okay, go down. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Scroll down, please. This has been answered.
That's right.
And next, from Professor Cheung. Trusted people.
Okay.
And whether the government is weak or actually not motivated to do good PR, good crisis management. And Johnny, go down, please. All right. The performance of Hubei, the reaction of Hubei government, and Singapore, WHO and the UN system. Herd immunity.
Yep. Scientific community divided.
And one more. Compare Hong Kong with UK.
Okay.
Okay, the anti-alcohol policy.
Other questions?
Okay, and one more.
Shuffle off real fast.
Good question. Okay, thank you for all the quite challenging questions, and both speakers now will try to wrap up and answer the questions in groups.
Okay. Now I try to very generally cover all the questions that we've just looked at. Now, I think one participant asked a question in relation to the use of octopus card. Professor Gabriel Leung suggested that maybe we can use that for the purpose of tracking. Now, I'm not going into the specifics of the specific tools suggested to be used for various purposes. But my point here is, whatever tool we use, whatever measures we take in such a crisis, we have to think not just in terms of government imposing a measure, a means of control, or we give some professional advice, but at the same time to perceive how the older people may feel affected, how they may respond to that, how specific arrangement might affect their way of everyday life. For example, the controversy regarding banning alcohol over the last few days, and I think eventually that specific proposal was put aside. Now, exactly, I think that is the issue. If we just narrowly consider, okay, if there is this infection cluster in a particular context or environment, okay, let's get rid of it. No alcohol or no Lan Gui Fong or whatever. But very often, the situation is not as simple as that. There are all kinds of consequences. For the time being, we say, okay, we don't allow people, we ask people not to go to office. But there are jobs, there are occupations where the workers, the employees have to attend to a place of work. Construction sites, for example. And public transport workers. So the question really is, we have to balance different concerns, different consequences. So ultimately, it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off, it's a balancing of 2 hours. The first hour is risk, the kind of risk, the extent of risk we are facing or we estimate to be the case. The second risk is the response. And it's all a matter of trade-off, balancing, it's all a matter of proportionality. We don't overdo, we don't underdo. But on balance, I would say that it's better to overdo a little bit than to underdo. It's like your dressing code. It's always overdressed. It's always better than underdressing. So that's the first point I would like to make. Secondly, comparing different countries, Hong Kong and the UK, obviously Hong Kong has done much better than the UK because first of all, older people are more alert to the health risks. They are willing to wear masks, although wearing masks is not the only way to minimize the hazard. And I think in the UK, the government has wasted a bit of time in terms of deciding the actual strategy. And the strategy was not communicated clearly. And that sort of makes the notion of herd immunity very much the center of the news. But this is just a concept, and a medical concept. But as far as government policy is concerned, or government communication concerned, no government can actually come out to say, sorry, we don't have enough surgical capacity. Some people have to die. Let those who can't cope die first, and then everybody in the population will become immune. No government can say that. So a scientific speculation or theorization is one thing, but practical public policy is another, because for every individual in society, he or she will feel that I'm the most important.
Yes.
So you can't just say, let everybody get infected first. Hong Kong and Singapore. In fact, I don't think Hong Kong has done worse than Singapore. We are both doing very well, but Singapore's crisis narrative, in my view, is done better than Hong Kong. From day one, the government has explained what it's going to do, what the crisis is like, putting people in context. But there is, in my view, a myth about face masks in Singapore. Because the Singapore government early on said it would give free face masks to the population. Then people forgot the number. Actually, the government only gave 4 face masks to every household. That's a drop of water in the sea. But people remember the government gave free face masks. In fact, Singapore faced the same problem as Hong Kong at that time. Not enough face masks. And therefore the government had to say, okay, we have to have priority. If you are not infected, no symptom, actually you don't need to have a face mask. And government and Singapore differs in one major aspect from Hong Kong. Schools in Singapore are still open. No school closures. So different cities deal with things differently. But if in Hong Kong, if the SAR government follows Singapore's practice and say, well, we are not going to close schools, I think that will be an uproar. So we have to take different social context, different public sentiments into account. Hubei, I think Hubei, in my view, the way the early alert about a new virus similar to SARS was sort of suppressed, was not communicated more quickly. I think that is a major setback. It's a major fault of the mainland system in dealing with that. But once the threat was officially recognized, the epidemic was recognized, I think the kind of actions taken has seemed to be quite successful. The lockdown of Wuhan and eventually Hubei, I think that sets the precedent, if you like. Right? Eventually every country, Italy, and then now every country is doing the same. So I think mainland China's way of dealing with the crisis following the outbreak, let's put aside crisis prevention first, but once the crisis has happened, those measures taken, they were tough. Maybe they were measures that could only be introduced in the mainland context, but they were effective. And I think by now many international experts recognize that. Now, whether or not there will be a reshuffling of world power, I think that still needs to be seen. My gut feeling, based on some initial comments by academics and other experts around the world, I think most expect China to come out of this crisis stronger, comparatively speaking. It's a bit like the 2008, 2009 global financial crisis. Because of that crisis, actually, China was able to catch up more faster with the US. So that since then, we were talking about G2 or Chimerica. I think that started from the GFC 2009 incident. So after this crisis, most expect China actually to do even better. But of course, we have yet to see how the economic depression situation will unfold in future. Gaining public trust. Now, public trust is so important to crisis management. And one of the reasons why the SAR government in Hong Kong has been questioned so much in its handling of the COVID-19 virus is not the specific pace and extent of infection control. In my view, maybe I'm prejudiced, I think the government has done, overall, the government has done well. But because people do not trust the government enough, and therefore sometimes measures got backfired.
Yeah, I think Professor Cheung responded very well to all the questions. So I may take another perspective to respond generally to some questions. So apologies, I can't cover all the questions. Now, I would like to take a little bit of a more sentiment handling perspective. Okay, so since I'm focusing on meaning making, narrative construction, so one of the sources, as we can see from the discussion, one of the sources of government credibility comes from the empathy and compassion. So crisis, once a crisis happens, there would be people, those people suffering, bearing the cost from the crisis. So these empathies and compassions are important for the government to reconstruct the credibility, to rebuild, to regain trust. Now, of course, as I said, it is easier said than done. Mostly the lessons learned on the textbook, but just relating back to the real world examples. For example, for the case of the UK, so when one of the participants mentioned the concept of herd immunity, as Professor Cheung mentioned, that this concept was a medical concept. Okay, so it might be shared widely, discussed widely in the scientific community, especially the medical community. But when it was advocated by the UK government, specifically the Boris Johnson government, when he didn't just mention the term herd immunity, he was also saying many of us are going to lose our loved ones. So you can see that these PR gesture, or I won't say this PR, is very, very genuine, okay, from a politician, from a leader of a country, and say, we are all going to suffer. Some of you are going to suffer the pain, and the government might not be able to respond, might not be able to help. So on one hand, you can say it's a expectation management, but on the other hand, people can easily read it as indifference. Okay, so government is just indifferent. They just don't care. Okay, they see our lives as a means to achieving what they call the herd immunity in order to save the whole nation. So my life, as Professor Cheung said, many of us sees our own lives as valuable. But on the other hand, the government might not be able to convince you that we are taking care of your life. For the case of Singapore, I agree that, so I agree with Professor Jones that Singapore, at the start, the Singapore government was able to promise that we are handing out masks to the residents. But while later, they discovered the masks were not enough. So it turned out to be another problem of supply for masks. But I might think about this a little bit differently. It was more about the rituals, okay, that government did at the beginning of the crisis. So I would say it was a matter of expectation management. But on the other hand, you can also say the Singapore government tried to calm down the Singaporean residents, the citizens, that the government knows what you care about, knows what you are desperate about. So at least in the first instance, we're handing out masks, maybe just 4 masks per household, but it is very symbolic. It's very symbolic. And it became kind of powerful narrative that feed back to the international community. When the Hong Kong people were reading the news about Singapore, they immediately got the impression the Singapore government cares about their citizens, but the Hong Kong government just left us there in the market fighting for the masses. Whether you have money, whether you have your own channels, it is your own problem. So I think if you compare the case of Hong Kong and the UK, so in Hong Kong, we didn't, the chief executive of the government didn't say, you are going to lose the loved ones. But I think on the other hand, so they are implicitly saying, you got to find your own way out in order to save your life, okay, to some extent, okay, including the purchase of face masks. So if you ask me questions about the state-society relationship, how we can regain the trust in the government, I think currently the state-society relationship is rather segregated. The government is on the one hand advocating a campaign, let's fight the virus together. But in the community, of course, coincidentally, we also care about the virus. But the resonance that the civil society, the responses, the actions that many people are doing are not necessarily following the narratives or the campaign of the government. So if you would like to say how we can restore the trust. It is difficult because of the burdens from the protests last year, from the burdens of about trust in the Hong Kong government in the first place. So I don't have any good recommendation. Otherwise, I will just be a hero. Okay, but in principle, my emphasis would be more on the sentiment. After all, crisis might need experts to resolve, but on the other hand, we need politicians, skillful politicians, to understand very well what the ordinary people are thinking. So no judgment about right or wrong, just a gesture of sympathy, compassion, more these kind of rituals to be done in front of the media, in front of the cameras. That might be the first step for the governments to regain the trust, to rebuild the credibility.
All right, okay, thank you very much, everyone. And we are overrunning for a few minutes. And thank you for staying with us for more than 2 hours. And I have chaired this dialogue series for 3 times, and I must say this appears to be the most successful one, despite the virtual online nature. And we have communicated so extensively. And before we close this session, could I take this opportunity to thank Professor Cheung and Dr. Wong again for their participation, especially during this special period of time. And then in the end, please stay safe and be healthy. And we look forward to meeting you elsewhere in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.